everyone, this is Cheryl and welcome to my sewing room. Are you new at sewing? Are you confused about what throat plate to put on? Or do you even know what a throat plate is? You didn't know you had options? Do you know what presser foot to use for what stitch? Do you know what stitch to use for all the different seams? Well, help is on the way, so let's get started. Before you begin stitching, you need to make sure that your machine is set up properly to accommodate the stitch you are using. All sewing machines are not necessarily labeled and set up the same way. Your throat plates, that's what these are right here, may look a little different than mine. This throat plate is made for a baby lock, and I actually have several throat plates for my baby lock. This throat plate is made for a Viking, and this is just one of the throat plates for that. On this throat plate, all the lines here, I have lines that are labeled in inches and down here in centimeters. On my Viking, it's only centimeters. So that goes to show you that not all machines are made exactly the same. On this one here, because the hole is really small, you would have this throat plate on if you're going to do a straight stitch. Over here, you'll see that this area here is very large for the needle to go through. You would use this type of throat plate with a really large opening for your zigzag stitches and any decorative stitching you may have on your machine. You also need to make sure that you're using the correct presser foot for the type of stitching you're trying to do. So if you're doing a straight stitch and you like to do quilting, it's really helpful if you're using either a 1/4 inch foot, and if you like to do stitch in the ditch, this is a stitch in the ditch foot. So how this works is, here is that little hole right here, and when you have it on your machine, that little hole just lines up over the hole on your presser foot. You would keep your raw edge of your fabric right on the edge of this 1/4 inch foot. You also have, of course, your 1/4 inch line right here, but it's more accurate if you've got the foot on there also. It's very, very helpful. Another one is if you're a quilter and you have a stitch in the ditch foot. That's a type of top stitching to hold all the layers of your fabric together. And on the back of this, it's a little easier to see, or maybe you can see here, there's a little metal plate that just goes straight down over that seam. So you would line it up, and it looks like you've got a really wide opening here, but really you don't. That little bar that's going down there in the middle, which is very hard to see right now, has a little curvature area, like a little C shape, where the needle goes right down in there. So you can get a really nice stitch in the ditch stitching pattern if you have this type of foot. If you're doing decorative stitching, a zigzag stitch, then you need to have a presser foot on that has a really wide opening. I don't know if you can see this very well. You see how large that opening is? So when it's on there, it's right over that wide opening on your throat plate. So it's really easy to do the decorative stitching. If you put this one on top and you selected a decorative stitch or a zigzag stitch with this throat plate on, the very first time the needle goes down, your needle is going to break because it's not going to go through that hole. So that's why it's important to make sure you have the correct presser foot going with the correct throat plate. If you're doing a zipper, and that's another type of seam because you're attaching a zipper in the seam of a garment or a pair of pants, you also need to have the correct presser foot on. If you have a computerized machine, which is what I really recommend, if you can afford a computerized machine, I would do it because you have such a huge variety of stitches. This is a wide zipper foot, and this is a narrow zipper foot. I not only use my narrow zipper foot for doing zippers, but I also use it for putting on piping because I can get real close to the piping and get a really nice edge. So when you're using either zipper foot on a computerized machine, you can switch your needle over to the left or to the right, and it goes right down in there. So that's why you need to have the wide opening throat plate on so that the needle will not jam up and break. Here is an example of a straight stitch, and these are basting stitches. A straight stitch on my machine, when I turn my machine on and I select it, the machine automatically sets it to a stitch length of 2.5. That doesn't mean you can't change it. You can still make it longer. So on your machine, if you don't have these basting stitches, you can just lengthen your straight stitch and you can get that basting stitch. On my machine, my basting stitches, I have several different settings. I can make it a 5 millimeter, 10 millimeter, 15 millimeter, and a 20 millimeter. So there again, when you're doing your straight stitch or your basting stitches, have the throat plate on with just this little hole there. So when you're using this one, your fabric should not jam up. If you're using a wide open throat plate opening here for the needle, sometimes the needle can push the fabric down in and then it jams up. So this helps to prevent jamming. So when you're using the throat plate with the wide opening, make sure your presser foot has the wide opening on it too, so that you can do your zigzag stitches. Now this is a normal looking zigzag stitch, and then here is a really tiny zigzag stitch. So you could put this on stretch knits like tricot for underwear, lycra for swimwear, jersey knits. So when you're doing your 5/8 inch seam, you would use this stitch. This you can use for other purposes, and I'll show you later what you can use this one for. Here is a little overlock stitch that I have on my machine. So you could do your 5/8 inch seam and then trim the excess off, and your seams would be bound so that when you wash your fabric, the seams will not unravel. Here is my screen on my machine. Now mine is a baby lock crescendo. I get asked that a lot. It is a very high-end machine. I don't recommend it if you are a beginner. So don't buy this one, but Baby Lock and Genome and Pfaff, Viking, they all offer entry-level computerized machines. So your computerized screen is probably going to look something like this. So when you hit the straight stitch or different zigzag stitches, up here it's going to tell you what the foot you need to use. For mine it says foot number J, and then it shows you what the stitch looks like already. And then down below it will show you the width, the length, if the needle is going either left or right, and the tension. So they're already preset for each stitch. That doesn't mean you can't change them, but you can. So you can increase it up or decrease it down. So to do the straight stitch, if I want a 1/4 inch seam, I'm just going to place my fabric right up against that 1/4 inch line. I'm going to lower my presser foot down, and I like to do a locking stitch right at the beginning. You can do a back stitch if you want, and then Do not look at the needle, just look at the line on your sewing machine. If you want to do the 5/8 inch seam, then here's my 5/8 inch line right here. I'm just going to place it right on there. I like to do that locking stitch, and by the way, you can also do it at the end. And I'm just going to watch this line right there. I'm going to keep my fabric right there on the edge. So if you say you can't sew a straight stitch, it's really hard to go wrong if you're not looking at the needle. Look at the line. When you're working with your stretch knits, you don't want to stretch the fabric as you're stitching, because if you're using the correct stitch, you don't need to do that. So I'm just going to do just a regular zigzag stitch on this stretch knit fabric I have. I have the edge of my fabric right there on my 5/8 inch line. I have my fabric lined up on the 5/8 inch line. I'm looking at the 5/8 inch line. I'm not looking at the needle. Let the fabric just glide underneath the presser foot. Do not stretch the fabric. So I'm just going to begin stitching. Now I'm just doing a standard zigzag stitch. All right, I'm going to take it out. And when you pull on it, it stretches. Now I'm going to do a smaller zigzag stitch, which is what I recommend if you're working with your knits and you're making clothing. So I'm going to just select a smaller one, and it is right here. And so here we go. All right, I'm going to take it out and show it to you. Now you can barely see it, it's really tiny, but yet it stretches. Here is some lycra fabric which you use for swimwear, and here is that last zigzag stitch that I did. So I did the 5/8 inch seam on it, and then you could cut it down to where it is a narrower seam. Here is another stitch you can use on stretch knits, and it's called a dotted zigzag. So let me just demonstrate it. I've got the edge of my fabric on the 5/8 inch line. I'm not looking at the needle. I'm looking at the 5/8 inch line. And this is what it looks like. It goes over 2 stitches, up 2 stitches, down 2 stitches, back over 2 stitches, and it keeps going back and forth. You can use this on fabric like this tricot that's used for underwear. So again, you can stitch it and then trim the excess fabric off the seam, and it will stretch a little bit. This seam right here is another type of stitch that you can use for some sweatshirt styles where you're putting the ribbing on the end of the arms. So you would go ahead and stitch it on like you see here. Here's the ribbing, and then you would just trim the excess off. If you like to work with denim, you want to make denim clothing, whether it's jeans or jackets or skirts, there's this really nice stitch that you can do on your machine. So I'm first just going to use a straight stitch, and I'm going to do a 5/8 inch wide seam. Then take your fabric and you would press it. I would do this at your ironing board. Press that seam to where you have the seam going in one direction. I've got my seam pressed to where it's going towards my left side. And the seam here, I'm putting it on the far edge of the opening on my presser foot because I want it to be a nice even stitch. And I'm selecting a triple stitch. So it's basically going to go back and forth in place 3 times. So I'm going to take it out now. And this is what it looks like. Now, if you are looking at your denim jeans, you can see how nice it can look on your jeans. So here it is on the back. I've got my standard straight stitch. Here's the edge of my fabric, and then here it is on the front. So on this particular type of seam, you're using 2 different stitches. The last seam that I'm going to show you is called the French seam. This seam is used on a lot of your formal wear, wedding dresses, fabrics that are really sheer where you don't want the raw edges to show through to the front, and you do not want your stitches also to show through. So you're going to divide your 5/8 inch wide seam into 2 different seam widths because there's 2 different stitching seam widths that you need to do. I know that's a little confusing right now. So take your 5/8 inch wide seam. You could divide the first one up to where it's 2/8, and which would be 1/4 of an inch. So your first seam would be 1/4 of an inch wide. Your second seam would be 3/8 inch wide. Or the version I like to use, because I've seen this done many different ways, is I like to have my first seam only 1/8 inch wide and my second seam 1/2 inch wide. So that's the one I'm going to demonstrate. So you want to have the back sides of your fabric together, not your front sides, the back side. So here is my center line on my machine. Here's my 1/4 inch line. So I'm going to keep the raw edge of my fabric right in between there. Okay, and that's how I'm going to start stitching. So I'm going to do my seam all the way down, doing it 1/8 of an inch wide. Now I'm going to fold it over, and I'm just going to finger press this seam and fold it over like this. And I like to finger press it a little bit. You could go to your ironing board, but because I'm just demonstrating right now, I don't want to take the time to go over there and press it with my iron, but you kind of get the idea. Now I'm going to do a 1/2 inch wide seam. So here is my 1/4 inch. Here is my 5/8 inch. I'm going to kind of keep it somewhere in the middle there and do another round. So you have a seam with no raw edges, so that when you wash your garment, the red edges aren't going to fall apart. When you open it to the front, there it is. But remember, you can also do a 1/4 inch wide seam and then a 3/8 inch wide seam. In upcoming videos, I will be demonstrating different methods of doing gathering stitches, different methods for doing a hem stitch, and also overlock stitches. For videos on beginners sewing projects, such as you see here, and clothing projects, play this video until a green screen appears and then click on the links. If you like this video, please click on thumbs up and don't forget to click on share to share this video with your friends. And if you haven't subscribed yet, click on that red subscribe button in the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Click on the bell and enter your email address so you receive email notifications about my latest video. This is Maria and Bailey. This is Jamie and Teddy. And this is Manny. So glad you came to my sewing room. See you next time and happy sewing!